The chapel at Ashford Minster held 43 candles that morning, and Cecily Brentwood counted every one of them. She counted because it gave her eyes somewhere to rest. That was not the face of the man standing 3 feet to her left, nor the faces of the assembled witnesses arranged in the pews like a jury that had already rendered its verdict. She counted because she had learned, in the 23 years of her quiet life, that precision was the steadiest armor against the particular cruelty of being overlooked, and she intended to be overlooked one last time before she removed that armor entirely. The man to her left was Richard Ashford, the Earl of Whitmore, 34 years old, £26,000 in annual income, and the author of a calculated decision she had known about since February. He required an heiress. Her father's solicitor had supplied one. The dowry was £50,000. The bride was plain, passably mannered, and unlikely to cause trouble. Those were the terms as she understood them, delivered second-hand through her cousin Agnes, who had overheard the solicitor tell her father's man of business that the Earl of Whitmore would not be difficult, provided the girl understood her station. Cecily understood her station perfectly. She had spent 6 years perfecting the understanding of it. The veil was heavy Honiton lace, Brussels point at the border, and it covered her face from brow to chin. Her maid had set it carefully that morning without comment, and Cecily had watched herself in the mirror for a long moment before she nodded. She looked in the mirror's honest light, exactly as the solicitor had described her. Plain and passably mannered, the veil completed the presentation. The vicar was speaking. The Earl of Whitmore stood with the still, composed patience of a man who had submitted to a necessary transaction and intended to see it through without complaint. She had learned that much about him in 3 brief, supervised meetings. He did not complain. He was courteous in the precise, economical way of a man who had been courteous so long it required no thought. He had looked at her hands when they spoke, she noticed, not at her face. At her hands, as though reading something there. She had not been able to determine what. The vows reached the moment she had been preparing for since February. The vicar said the words. The Earl of Whitmore turned toward her. His hands, gloved in white, reached for the edges of the veil. And Cecily Brentwood, soon to be Cecily Ashford, Countess of Whitmore, let him lift it. She heard, before she saw his face, the sound that moved through the chapel like a wave breaking at a distance, a collective intake of breath, 6 rows deep, quickly suppressed. She heard Lady Harmon, 3 pews back, say something that was not quite a word. She heard the peculiar silence that followed, which was the silence of 40 people rearranging a picture they had believed was settled. She watched the Earl of Whitmore's face. He had not made a sound. His expression was not shock, precisely. It was something slower and more controlled than shock, a stillness that held all of its response behind the eyes rather than releasing it into the face. He was a man, she noted for the first time clearly, with exceptionally steady eyes. They were the color of polished slate in good light, and they were looking at her now with an attention that was nothing at all like the courteous, economical attention he had given her hands in 3 supervised meetings. He said very quietly, Miss Brentwood. My lord, she said with equal precision. The vicar cleared his throat. The Earl of Whitmore's jaw shifted once, as though he were adjusting the alignment of something internal. Then he took her hand, turned back to the vicar, and completed the ceremony. He had not, she observed, looked away from her once. 6 years before that morning, Cecily had been, by the judgment of the 2 counties that tracked such things, the most arresting young woman of her season. It was not a judgment she had sought or particularly trusted, but it had existed, and its existence had taught her things she had not expected to learn at 17. What she learned first was that attention was not the same as seeing. The young men who sought her out at assemblies, who pressed her hand in cotillions, who arrived with morning calls and nosegays, were not looking at Cecily. They were looking at something she inhabited briefly, and which did not in any material way resemble her. It was a bright surface that reflected their own wishful projections back at them with a pleasing degree of clarity. When she spoke carefully about the poor rates, or declined to laugh at a joke that required someone's dignity as its punchline, or asked an honest question about a subject that embarrassed the questioner, the attention cooled to politeness and then moved along. What she learned second was that her father's solicitor, Mr. Graves, possessed a variety of intelligence that was entirely social, and therefore entirely wrong about her. He had told her father, in a voice that carried through a paneled door, that Cecily's prospects in a second season would be materially improved if she could manage a pleasanter expression and fewer opinions. She had listened at the door without guilt and filed the observation away. What she learned third was that appearances could be maintained or withdrawn according to circumstance, and that a woman who controlled what she showed the world possessed a species of power the season did not account for. Her father was a kind man who worried. In the months after the second season, when the proposals she had declined became the ammunition with which Lady Harmon and her circle described her as difficult, Cecily had watched him begin to age in a way that was specific and frightening. The estates were managed well enough. The income was steady. Her father was 61, and the entail passed through the male line. There was a cousin in Shropshire who had already written twice about a visit that need not be postponed indefinitely. Her father did not say any of this aloud. He was too kind for that. He simply developed a habit of watching her at dinner with an expression she could not quite name, and she found she could not bear it. She had gone to his study in January, a full week before the solicitor's visit, and told him to accept whatever offer came. He had looked at her for a long time across the desk. Then he said, "You are certain, Cecily?" It was not quite a question. "I am certain," she said, "that I would rather choose the terms of my situation than have them chosen for me." She had thought carefully, after that conversation, about those terms. The Earl of Whitmore was a widower of 4 years, not unkind by general report, in possession of a substantial estate, and in need of capital that her dowry would supply. He had not, in 3 meetings, been condescending or deliberately cruel. He had treated her as a woman of reasonable intelligence, which was more than many men managed. He did not require beauty because he had not been told he was getting it. That was the thing she had decided. He had not been told he was getting it, because his solicitor had not mentioned it, and her father's solicitor had thought it irrelevant, and nobody in her current social world had thought to ask what she actually looked like when she was not composed behind the particular expression. She wore for the marriage market. The season at 17 was 6 years ago, and 3 counties away. The plain, passably mannered daughter of the late Mr. Brentwood had been produced from behind 6 years of deliberate self-presentation, and the Earl of Whitmore had agreed to marry her on that basis, and she had decided, in the weeks before the wedding, that she wanted to know what a man who had agreed to marry plainness did with something that surprised him. She was not, she had told herself, being cruel. She was being honest in a way the world had never required of her. She was lifting the veil when the veil lifting was the literal and appointed moment. And whatever happened next was the truth of the matter. She had not anticipated the sound in the chapel. She had not anticipated that it would move her. The wedding breakfast at Whitmore House was arranged in the long dining room, which held 30 people at formal table and another 12 at the secondary table near the windows. Lady Harmon occupied a seat 2 removes from the hostess chair, which was not the seat she had expected, and Cecily could see from her position at the Earl's right hand the precise moment when Lady Harmon recognized the social calculation embedded in the arrangement. Lady Harmon said nothing about it. She was too skilled for that. Instead, she turned to Mrs. Fenton, her right-hand neighbor, and said in a carrying voice that the veil had been very fine work, though she supposed Brussels point required an exceptional amount of patience from the lace-maker. Mrs. Fenton said, which was the social equivalent of a closed door, and Lady Harmon tried again. The Earl was very collected, she said, considering. Considering what? Mrs. Fenton asked. There was a pause in which Lady Harmon recognized that she had stepped onto ground that would not support her, and retreated to her soup. The Earl of Whitmore, beside Cecily, said nothing for several minutes. He attended to his plate and his glass and the conversations flowing around him with the same composed patience she had observed in their 3 previous meetings, and Cecily attended to hers, and the breakfast progressed. She was accustomed to silence beside men who occupied rooms by rank. She had found it, over the years, more comfortable than their speech. Then he said, without particular inflection, "You are not what I was told to expect." "No," she agreed. "You knew that." "I did." A pause, measured and still. "Why?" She considered for a moment whether to give him the honest answer, and then decided that honesty was the point, had been the point since February, and that to deflect now would be to put the veil back on. "Because I wanted to know," she said. "What kind of man you were when surprised." He was quiet for a moment. She felt, rather than saw, the shift in the quality of his attention, the slight recalibration of something she could not name. "And?" he said. "The jury is still deliberating," she said. Something moved in his face that was not quite amusement and was not quite alarm and was, she thought, its own species entirely. Something she had no prior experience of reading in a man's expression. He returned to his glass. His posture, she noticed, had changed by something too small to describe and too real to dismiss. If anyone had asked Cecily afterward to describe the first month of her marriage to the Earl of Whitmore, she would have said that it was characterized, above all, by the careful and mutual process of taking an accurate account of someone you had not met before. Whitmore House in Hampshire was a substantial estate, working and well-maintained, with a household staff of 22, an accounting ledger she had quietly asked to review in the 3rd week and been granted without comment, and a library that ran to floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls and smelled of good leather and old paper. The library was where she found the Earl most often in the first weeks, and where she began to understand the particular geography of his reserve. He was not cold. She had prepared herself for cold, had assembled her own corresponding armor against it, and found herself slightly wrong-footed by the discovery that what she had been told was his coldness was something else entirely. A thoroughgoing seriousness, a preference for precision over social lubrication, a discomfort with the currency of pleasantness that many people confused with its absence. He did not make conversation for the sake of filling silence. When he said something, he meant it. She found this. After 6 years of a world that said almost nothing, it meant extraordinarily restful. She had her first unobserved sight of him on a morning in the 2nd week, though she would not have called it that at the time. She had gone down early, before breakfast, to look at a section of East Quarter accounts she had not yet worked through, and had come along the passage beside the stables when she heard voices from the yard. The head groom's daughter was perhaps 8 years old, and she was sitting on the mounting block with her hand pressed to her cheek in a way that suggested a tooth, and weeping with the particular soundless intensity of a child who does not wish to be noticed, but cannot stop. The Earl of Whitmore was crouched beside the mounting block, his good coat entirely indifferent to the cobblestones, and he was speaking to her in a low voice that Cecily could not quite hear from the passage's corner. She did not move. She was aware that she ought to announce herself, that watching was a kind of intrusion, and she watched anyway. He produced something from his coat pocket, a small paper twist of the sort that confectioners used. The girl's weeping slowed. He said something, and the girl said something back, and he tilted his head as though her answer required serious consideration, which it apparently did, because he then said something further in a tone of grave consultation that made the girl, despite the tooth and the tears, offer a very small and watery smile. He patted her shoulder once, carefully, and stood, and turned toward the house. He saw Cecily at the corner of the passage. He stopped. She did not apologize for watching. She simply said, "She will need a poultice for that tooth. Mrs. Rowe keeps cloves in the stillroom." "I know," he said. "I have asked her." "Good," Cecily said, and went into her accounts. She thought about it all morning, in a quiet and methodical way that she associated with things requiring careful cataloging rather than immediate response. The Earl of Whitmore had crouched on stable cobblestones for the sake of a groom's daughter's tooth. He had produced, from his own coat pocket, a paper twist of sweets that no one had given him a reason to carry. He had treated her small distress as a matter of genuine consultation. She had been told he was not unkind. She found that morning that not unkind was a significant understatement. She found the portrait on a Wednesday in the third week, in the gallery on the first floor, tucked at the corridor's turning where the light did not quite reach it. A woman in a white gown, painted in the style of 8 or 9 years ago. Young, dark-haired. The kind of beauty that was so clear it almost hurt to look at directly. The portrait had been turned slightly, not quite to the wall. Not quite facing forward either. She did not ask about it. She filed it away. The housekeeper, Mrs. Rowe, was 62 years old and had been in the house since the Earl's father's time, and she possessed the efficient warmth of a woman who had watched a great deal happen and drawn her own conclusions from it. She told Cecily, without being asked, in the 4th week, that the late Countess had died in her second confinement, that the child had died with her, and that the Earl had not, in 4 years, moved the portrait. Cecily said, "Thank you, Mrs. Rowe," and meant it as a complete sentence. The guilt arrived later, in the library, where she had gone to read and found she could not. She sat for a long time with an unopened book and thought about a man who had agreed to marry a woman described as plain and unlikely to cause trouble, and about what it cost a person who had already lost someone they had not expected to lose to submit to a transaction they had arranged for practical reasons and nothing else. He had not expected to be surprised. She had decided to surprise him. She had told herself it was honesty. And it was. But it was also the imposition of her test onto a man who had not known he was being tested. She thought about the stable yard. She thought about a paper twist of sweets carried in a coat pocket for no reason anyone could name. She thought about the way he had crouched on cobblestones, entirely regardless of his coat, and given a child's tooth the same serious consideration he gave to drainage accounts and East Quarter ledgers. She thought about the portrait at the corridor's turning, half averted, and about what it meant to be the kind of man who could not quite put a thing away, but could not quite face it either, and who had come, 4 years after, to a solicitor's arrangement because the alternative was the continued silence of a house that held too much of someone who was no longer in it. She had walked into that silence with a veil and a test, and she was not at all certain, sitting in the library in the late afternoon, that she had understood what she was walking into. She was still sitting there when the door opened. The Earl came in without ceremony, removed his coat, draped it over the chair he habitually used, and moved to his usual position at the far end of the table before he noticed her. He stopped. I did not know you were here, he said. I was thinking, she said. He considered this, the way he considered most things, as though thinking required the same precision as accountancy. Then he said, About what? About the fact, she said carefully, that I was not entirely fair to you. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down in his chair, very deliberately, and gave her his full attention in the way she had come to understand was his version of stepping across a threshold. The veil, he said. The veil, she said. And what I intended by it. I told myself I wanted to know what kind of man you were. That was true. I did not consider what it cost you to be the subject of someone else's test. The room was quiet. A fire was going, and outside the window the November afternoon had gone the color of pewter, and somewhere in the house a door closed at a distance. I knew, he said finally, within the first quarter hour of our acquaintance, that you were not as described. She went still. Not your appearance, he said. Your hands. He paused. And the way you listened when I spoke. You listened as though you were recording the words, not performing the act of receiving them. I have not met many people who listen that way. She found she had nothing to say, which was itself unusual. I did not know, he continued, what I was being offered. I knew it was not what had been advertised. He looked at the table for a moment, at his own hands resting there. I thought about declining, after the first meeting. Why did you not? Another pause, slower than the first. Because you asked me, at the end of that meeting, whether the North Wing drainage problem had been addressed by the estate's agent or by outside contract. And when I told you it had been addressed by the agent under my own oversight, you said, Good. Contractors at speed make expensive errors, and agents who are given latitude usually make better ones. And I thought, sitting in my carriage on the way home, that I had not had a conversation like that in 4 years. Cecily looked at him for a long time. I am sorry, she said. About the portrait, and about what it must have cost you to come here that morning and submit to a transaction. We both submitted, he said. Yes, she said. But your grief was not a performance. Something shifted in his face, deep and controlled, the way something moves beneath still water. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, No, it was not. They sat in the library until the fire burned low, and the light outside went from pewter to dark, and Mrs. Rowe sent the footman to light the lamps at 6. And the Earl of Whitmore said, at some point after the lamps were lit. Her name was Catherine. She was 24. He paused for a moment. She was not afraid of anything. I found that, at the time, entirely baffling. She would argue with me about the management of the south pasture at breakfast, and then spend the afternoon teaching the housemaid's youngest to identify the birds in the garden by their songs. She said that most men found her exhausting. I found I could not locate the part of myself that was supposed to find it exhausting. He stopped. His hands were still on the table. She died on a Thursday in September. The child was 3 days old when she was delivered, and did not survive the 4th. I was in the house. I was in the house for all of it, and I could not do anything about any of it. Cecily did not speak. She sat very still and let the words be what they were. I sold her horse in the spring, he said. I could not look at it. I still cannot quite account for that. Grief is not accountable, Cecily said. That is one of its properties. He looked at her. No, he said. I suppose it is not. Then he said nothing else about it, and Cecily did not ask. And the silence that followed was the companionable kind that she had not known was possible between two people who had each been, for different reasons, very much alone. The difficulty came as she had understood from the beginning it would come from the direction of Lady Harmon. Lady Harmon was not malicious, precisely. She was invested, She had spent the better part of 4 years identifying Lady Constance Vane as the correct match for the Earl of Whitmore, had introduced them 3 times at carefully arranged occasions, had told everyone who would listen that the connection was settled in all but formality. Lady Constance was 26, exquisitely dressed, in possession of a face that the season had declared the best thing it had seen in half a decade, and she had a mother who understood social machinery as one understands the mechanism of an excellent clock, by the sound it made when every gear was properly engaged. The wedding had been, from Lady Harmon's perspective, not a wedding, but a breach. She expressed this, in the weeks that followed, by the method available to women of her position and skill. She talked, not unkindly, not in terms that could be directly answered. She talked the way a person describes the weather, as though she were simply reporting conditions that existed independently of her observation. The conditions she reported were these: that the new Countess of Whitmore was, of course, a great surprise, that nobody had quite expected it, that the Earl had been, she supposed, lonely enough to be taken in, that the Vale had been, she would grant, very prettily managed, though one wondered about the calculation involved. That one hoped, for the Earl's sake, that what was under the veil would prove as durable as what was outside it. Cecily heard about these reports, as she heard about most things, through Mrs. Rowe. She heard about them without surprise, without particular distress, and without the intention of doing anything about them. She was not interested in Lady Harmon's opinion of her as a social fact. She was only interested in the Earl of Whitmore's opinion of her as a personal one, and that seemed, in the slow, careful accumulation of their daily life together, to be evolving according to its own logic and at its own pace. The Earl heard about them too, she discovered, because he told her. "Lady Harmon has been talking," he said one morning at breakfast, without preliminary, in the way he communicated most things. "I know," she said. "Does it trouble you?" She thought about this. "It would trouble me," she said, "if it were untrue. The veil was a calculation. She is correct about that. The rest of it she is wrong about, but the wrong parts are not her business to understand." He looked at her steadily. "She called you a managing woman." "I am a managing woman," Cecily said. "I reviewed your North Wing drainage accounts in November and found a contractor's overcharge from 3 years ago that your agent had not caught. I recovered £47. The Earl set down his coffee cup. Something in his face had shifted to the thing she now recognized as his version of being moved. "He told me," he said. He was mortified. He ought not to be. He was given an excessive number of accounts to oversee. I told him so. A long pause. Outside, frost was burning off the grass in the early winter sun. "I will speak to Lady Harmon," he said. "You need not," Cecily said. "She will say what she says, and stop saying it when it stops being interesting. The season has new material constantly." He considered this. "She is attending the Harrogate Assembly in January. You will be there." "I know." He looked at her for a moment with the slate-gray eyes that she had come to understand were the face of the man, rather than its surface. "I will not have you managed by her in that room," he said. She found, to her own surprise, that something in her chest tightened at that. She had been managed by public rooms for years. The idea that someone intended to stand between her and the management of one was, she discovered, a thing she had no framework for. "I can manage myself," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I intend to stand there anyway." The Harrogate Assembly was held on a Tuesday, which was the day it was always held, and the day on which half of Hampshire expected to conduct its social business, renew its rivalries, and refresh its judgments. The rooms were warm with candlelight and the smell of hothouse flowers and 70 people in wool and silk, and Cecily entered them on the arm of the Earl of Whitmore in a gown of deep green silk that was not, by any standard of the season, the gown of a woman who had accepted the terms she had been offered. She had chosen the gown with intention. She was not, she had decided, going to spend the rest of her life demonstrating that she had been hidden. She had hidden when hiding served a purpose. It did not serve one anymore. She was aware in the moment of entering of the room's attention shifting. Not obviously, not loudly, in the way that attention shifts in rooms that have been told one thing and are being shown another, a kind of collective recalibration that moved through the assembled company in ripples too small to name but too real to miss. She felt the Earl's arm steady under her hand, and she understood that he felt it too, and that he had decided, before they walked through the door, exactly what to do with it. Lady Harmon saw her from across the room. Cecily watched the social calculation happen in her face in the space of 2 seconds, and then watched the calculation resolve into the smile that Lady Harmon deployed when she was repositioning. Lady Constance Vane was present. She was in ice blue, as she nearly always was, and she was precisely as beautiful as her reputation, and she watched Cecily enter the room with an expression that was not hostility and was not warmth, but was the expression of a person absorbing new information that requires significant rearrangement of prior conclusions. Lady Harmon moved across the floor toward them at the pace of a woman with a gracious greeting prepared in advance. The Earl of Whitmore's hand shifted, the faintest degree, at Cecily's back. "My lord," Lady Harmon said, and then, with the smile adjusted, "Lady Whitmore, what a lovely thing to see you in the rooms." "Lady Harmon," Cecily said, "you are looking well." "The season suits me," Lady Harmon said, "though I confess I had expected you a little earlier. We heard such interesting reports from Hampshire." There was a precise weight to the word interesting, the weight of someone who expected it to land and was watching where it fell. "I imagine you did," Cecily said pleasantly. "The drainage accounts were interesting. £47 is not a trivial sum." A pause, just perceptible. "I beg your pardon?" "We had an overcharge from a contractor 3 years running. I found it in November. It is the kind of thing that is easy to miss when an estate agent is overextended. I have recommended that Lord Whitmore engage a second agent for the East Quarter." Lady Harmon's smile remained in position, but something behind it had shifted with the faint sound of a recalibration. "How very," she began. "Efficient," said the Earl of Whitmore. The single word fell into the conversation with the weight of a dropped piece of silver, and Lady Harmon looked at him, and something passed across her face that was not quite shame, but was in the neighborhood of it. "Just so," she said after a moment in a different voice. They moved on. The Earl guided Cecily toward the supper room with his hand at her back, and they passed Lady Constance, who met Cecily's eyes for a brief moment and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod that was, Cecily thought, the most honest thing anyone had offered her all evening. She nodded back. If you have watched someone discover that they were wrong about a person and have found it as quietly wonderful as she did, you will understand why Cecily moved through the rest of that evening as though the rooms themselves had changed their opinion. They drove home in the carriage in the particular dark of a December country night, and the Earl said nothing for a time, and then said, "You managed that very well." "We managed it," she said. A pause. The wheels turned over the frozen road with a low, steady sound, and outside the window there was nothing but dark fields and the occasional far light of a farmhouse. "Lady Constance," he said. "You saw her?" "Yes." "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that the connection Lady Harmon had arranged was not one I had ever confirmed." "I know," Cecily said. "You do not confirm things you have not decided." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I do not." The carriage rolled on through the dark. She was aware of him beside her in the particular way she had become aware of him over the preceding weeks, a low, steady awareness of the space between them that she had given up trying not to feel. His shoulder was very close to hers in the carriage's interior. She could feel the warmth of him through her coat, and she was quite sure he was similarly aware of her, because she had become adept at reading the quality of his stillness. And the stillness beside her in that carriage was not indifferent. She thought, sitting in that carriage in the dark, that she was going to have to say something honest to him before very long. Not yet. Not yet. Before very long, though. Outside, frost was beginning to form on the fields, and the sky was clear and full of stars, in the way it was only clear in December. And she sat beside her husband and thought about the particular quality of a decision that had taken 6 months to make and 5 minutes to reveal, and about what it meant that the man beside her was, of all the things she had considered when she stood in her father's study in January, the thing she had not allowed herself to consider at all. She had considered duty. She had considered practicality. She had considered her father's relief and the north wing drainage and the solicitor's report of a man who was courteous and not given to complaint. She had not considered that the Earl of Whitmore might listen to her speak about contractor errors and feel, as she now understood he had felt, that something in his library had changed in quality. She had not considered that she might care what he thought. This realization arrived in the carriage on the way home from Harrogate, with the unhurried precision of a thing that had been assembling itself for months and had only now presented its completed form for her inspection. The carriage rolled to a stop at the house. The footman opened the door. The Earl stepped down and turned and held out his hand, and she took it. And for a moment they stood on the gravel drive in the cold December air with the house lit behind them, and frost beginning on the hedgerow. And the Earl of Whitmore looked at her with the slate-gray eyes and said very quietly, "Come inside." She did. January came in with rain, and February brought a thaw that flooded the south lane and required 2 weeks of gravel work that Cecily supervised from the kitchen door with a plan she had drawn up on the back of an invitation card. The second agent was hired in March. The East Quarter accounts were reorganized. The gallery on the first floor received new curtains in the spring, dark green velvet, and the portrait at the corridor's turning was moved. Not removed, but moved to a wall where the afternoon light caught it properly, and it could be seen. Cecily had not suggested this. She had found it one morning when she came up the gallery stairs, and she had stood for a moment looking at it, and then looked at the Earl, who was standing at the far end of the corridor watching her. "She would have found you formidable," he said. She considered this. Was she not formidable herself? "She was warm," he said. "She had no armor. I think she would have found yours entirely baffling and been desperately curious about how you assembled it." Cecily looked at the portrait for another moment. "I am sorry I did not get to know her," she said. He came and stood beside her. They stood for a moment together, looking at the portrait in the afternoon light, and then he said, "The solicitor's report called you plain." His voice was level, in the way it was when he was saying something he had been considering for a long time. "I did not question it because I had not met you. I want you to know that I found it on the morning of the wedding, when you removed the veil, entirely beside the point." "Because I was not plain?" she said. "Because," he said. By the morning of the wedding, I already knew that you were not what had been described, and the question of your appearance was the least interesting revision I needed to make. She looked at him. What was the most interesting? He was quiet for a moment. That you had chosen me, he said. Not the transaction, not the arrangement. You had come to that chapel having considered the terms, and decided that the man was worth the test. She said, You cannot know that? I know, he said, that you asked me, in our third meeting, whether I found the work of the estate more satisfying than the social obligations of the season. And when I said yes, you said, Good. So do I. And I thought then that whatever else was true about the arrangement, that particular thing was not arranged at all. She found that she had no answer for a moment. Then she said, Richard. It was the first time she had used his given name. He looked at her, and the thing that moved in his face was not slow this time, and not controlled, and she thought it was the most honest thing she had seen in the year of their acquaintance, which had been, on balance, a year of exceptional honesty. Cecily, he said. The afternoon light came through the gallery window and lay across the portrait and across them both, and the house was quiet around them in the particular way of houses in early spring, when the work of the season is beginning, and everything is about to come in from the cold. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked back down the gallery together, past the velvet curtains and the afternoon light. And the portrait watched them go in the way that things watch, which have been a long time in the dark, and are glad, at last, to see clearly. They walked through into the morning room, where a fire was going, and a letter from her father waited on the side table. And outside the window, the south lane was repaired, and the fields were greening, and the thaw had done its work. And she sat down beside her husband in the warm, ordinary light of a household that had, in the steady accumulation of its daily life, become the thing that she had stood in her father's study in January and told herself she would not let herself hope for. Her father's letter said that he was well, that the cousin in Shropshire had written again, and that he had written back to say there was no need to hurry. That he had heard from Agnes that Cecily seemed settled, and that he was glad of it, and that he had, perhaps, he admitted, understood less than he thought he did about the terms on which she had been operating. She folded the letter when she had read it, and looked at the fire for a moment. He is well, she said. I am glad, said the Earl of Whitmore, and meant it. Outside, the spring was coming in over the Hampshire fields, with its particular English patience, unhurried and accumulative, the way most true things arrive. Inside, the fire burned steady and warm, and the letter from her father lay folded in her hand, and the Earl had picked up a newspaper, and was reading it in the silence that was, between the two of them, the best kind of conversation they knew. She, who had learned at 17 that attention was not the same as seeing, and at 23 that a veil was something you could choose to remove, and at 23 years and some months that the choosing was not the end of the story but only its beginning, sat beside her husband in the morning room of Whitmore House, and felt, in the unhurried way of things that are very sure of themselves, entirely at home. Thank you for sitting with this story until the end. If it moved you, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you longest.